Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
Hamza Khan is a best-selling author, award-winning entrepreneur, and globally renowned keynote speaker whose TEDx talk, Stop Managing and Start Leading, has been viewed over 2 million times. The world's leading organizations trust him to enhance modern leadership, inspire purposeful productivity, nurture lasting resilience, and navigate constant change. In this podcast episode, we discuss how to stop managing and start leading. I am so excited to have Hamza Khan on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. I first met Hamza earlier this year at Venture for Canada's All Things People conference, where Hamza did an amazing job providing the keynote remarks at our conference. And he speaks on many different topics, but one of the areas that he has the most passion and interest in is how to coach leaders to stop managing and start leading. Hamza, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How are you doing today?
Scott, wow, that is quite the introduction, sir. I am doing very well. I'm happy, I'm thriving, and I'm just so honored to be here with you again. Thank you for inviting me to deliver the keynote at All Things People. That was one of my favorite speaking engagements in my career. I look back at my time with you and your team very, very fondly. As I said before we jumped on this podcast, I'm a huge fan of you, Venture for Canada as an organization, forever a champion, and it is an absolute thrill to be back here and to extend the learning and pick up on some themes that were presented. Thank you for having me, and to all the listeners and viewers, thank you for being here.
Thank you for that, Hamza. So to dive into the theme, Hamza, what is the difference between managing and leading?
The short answer is you manage things and you lead people. Right? I'll say that again. You manage things, but you lead people. But Scott, you have asked a remarkably enduring question, and I think one that demands an expanded, nuanced answer. It's an attempt of mine over the next few months and years to really just say the final word on this subject, to move away from management as a paradigm altogether towards leadership. Now, fundamentally, the dichotomy between management and leadership rests with how power is wielded. And I think it's important to unpack what I mean by power when I say that. Power is the ability to convince somebody to do something that they otherwise would not do. And so when we talk about power in the context of management and leadership, we see that the difference is fundamentally coercion as an application of power through management and collaboration and co-creation through leadership. So in this way, some of the much more nuanced differences between management and leadership are discipline versus coaching, for instance, short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. A manager executes plans, whereas a leader develops a vision. A manager maintains the status quo, whereas a leader motivates change. Other differences could include managers serving bosses, whereas leaders serve their colleagues. Managers do the right things or do things right, whereas leaders do the right thing. Then you can go into using conflict versus establishing harmony, being focused on process versus being focused on purpose. Managers see the trees, leaders see the forest. Managers are transactional, whereas leaders are transformational. I mean, the list is exhaustive, but it comes back down to coercion versus collaboration. That is the fundamental difference between management and leadership. And I think these dichotomies, Scott, are best illuminated through what's known in the leadership literature as the dominant style of leadership and the prestige style of leadership, and they are opposites of one another. Dominance is exactly what it sounds like. It's foot on your neck, top-down, authoritarian, coercive. The challenge with dominance-oriented leadership is that it doesn't replicate. People don't like to be managed. People don't like to be treated in that way. And so as a result, that style of wielding power doesn't naturally, organically reproduce, whereas the prestige style of leadership is emulated because it's respected, and it's something that we as humans, as sentient beings, are inherently drawn to. It's how we want to be treated. And it's the only version of those two styles of leadership that is organically and naturally reproduced. So long story short, you manage things like budgets, events, tasks, and processes, but people are meant to be led. Great question. And I think it's one that deserves a more nuanced answer.
Venture for Canada, we recently did this survey through McKinsey that is done for across like hundreds of different nonprofits, and it measures organizational health and I think like improvement. And it was interesting. We rated really low on authoritarian leadership, which was actually a little bit of a critique by McKinsey, which is kind of interesting. All this still leads me to like a question of, is there a time for that more, okay, let's have a discussion, coaching style? And then is there another time sometimes for that more dominance approach of leadership, that more authoritarian approach? Like in essence, my question to you, Hamza, is that authoritarian approach always one that you think should be shunned?
Wow, this is what a fantastic question. I'm so curious to know more about McKinsey's feedback. Um, essentially, what they said, and I don't mean to answer a question with a question. I just need some clarification here. Was their suggestion that Venture for Canada, because they scored low on authoritarian style leadership, that they were less effective as an organization? Am I understanding that correctly?
It's a little vague. So if someone from McKinsey is listening to this, it's to say that, but it was broadly like they score you on like 50 different things. And it
Sure.
was broadly, generally, it's looped in with other things that would be more standard of like areas of improvement. So, for instance,
Okay.
like project management, but one could also interpret it as not necessarily a critique.
Okay.
I would say it's a little ambiguous. I think at least my interpretation of it is that I think that they would view authoritarian leadership as not always a bad thing. That in
Right.
some cases it would be needed. At least to me, that was the implicit kind of assumption based on how the data was presented.
Absolutely, and I agree with you, and I like the disclaimer for anyone from McKinsey who's listening to this. I too huge fan. I'm a huge fan of McKinsey. I rely on their research quite a bit. Their heart's in the right place. They're asking all the right questions, and they're generally orienting toward a more human centric future of work. So shout out to McKinsey. Um, it's interesting. There are certain situations in which an authoritarian style of management um, would be more effective. And the caveat is that people have to be bought into this. It can't be the approach at all times. There are absolutely situations where people need to be managed. For example, when timelines are very tight and everybody's agreed on the vision, has agreed on the strategy, knows what needs to be done, and needs that extra motivation, that extra sort of push approach to getting things done, to hustle towards the finish line. It's also needed sometimes in the nightmare situations, like when you have a rogue employee, or if somebody is, just not living up to their expectations because they're failing to manage their time, energy, and attention effectively, despite repeated coaching attempts. And so, the responsible thing for a human-centric leader to do in that situation is to help that employee, to coach them out of that situation. And if they're unable to be coached out of it, then they have to be swiftly facilitated to exit the organization. And I'm a firm believer that there's no such thing as bad employees, there's only bad bosses. And that's a tough thing for people to receive. But a good boss, a good leader is able to buy people into temporary, time bound usages of authoritarian power, of dominance style leadership. A good example would be a basketball game, right? Everybody knows that you have to score more points than your opponent. I try to resist using sports and war analogies. I think they're very tired and they don't really speak to the nuance of positive sum endeavors like the businesses we're building. But I think the metaphor is still very salient here. In the context of needing to hustle in the fourth quarter to get more points over the opponent, I think if everybody buys into the idea that they'll default to the captain of the team to manage, that is more effective arguably, than taking the prestige oriented leadership approach. But again, it's very specific and it has to be time bound. And the ultimate key is that people have to be bought into it. Nobody likes to be under a dominant style leader or in a dominance culture for a long period of time, especially if they haven't bought into it. Save that for the nightmare situations, save that for the extreme situations in which, um, you know, uh, uh, you're in survival mode essentially.
Yeah, what I am hearing from you is when someone is like a wartime CEO, when somebody is dealing with like a crisis, like let's say COVID or various other things that come up, then it does maybe make sense to flick that switch a little bit and say, okay, we need to move really fast, that get people's consent, and then operate a little bit more with that authoritarian approach. But hearing from you, and it's something I agree with, is the vast majority of times when you're not dealing with a hair on fire situation, it makes more sense to have that kind of coaching, that prestige leadership approach to managing. And one thing I would love to dive deeper in, Hamza, is that around 7 years ago, you did a TED talk that has been extremely widely viewed on this topic. What have been some of the main ways that your thinking on this has changed, has evolved over the last 7 years?
Yeah, thank you. It hasn't been that long. That's wild. 7 years. My my thinking around the core message of that talk, which is stop managing, start leading, has not changed. It has remained intact. I believe in that in 2023 as firmly as I believed in it in 2017, I believe, when it was published, or 2020, between 2014 and 2017, when it was recorded and when it was published is different. But I will say this, that I lost nearly all confidence in the message and by extension in myself as a leader in the immediate aftermath of the talk. And I think I must have only spoken about this maybe once or twice on a podcast. And I alluded to it very briefly in my most recent book, Leadership Reinvented. But Scott, here we go. The day after, shit, not even the day after, the night I delivered that TEDx talk, which was very well received by the audience and especially by peers, people who understood fundamentally that they don't want to be managed, they want to be led. I was sent a very terse email by my boss at the time, who said, "We need to meet first thing in the morning." And I was like, "Oh no, what did I do?" And sure enough, I go meet my boss the next day, and my boss is disappointed. My boss says, "I can't believe you did this talk without my knowledge. You should have run these ideas by me. You have caused a world of problems for me." All of my colleagues, paraphrasing from my boss, are irate. They're questioning my leadership. They're questioning this strange operation that you're running, in which people have unlimited vacation, can work from home before it became the norm, in which you take a very laissez-faire approach to management. You're not managing at all, you're leading. And one of the requests that was made of me by this boss was to go on an apology tour of the organization and explain more nuanced, in a more nuanced way, my thinking around creating this team, this utopia of a team that was, again, performing at the highest possible level, winning all kinds of awards. The outcome of our work was being celebrated and being touted as an example by my boss, but yet the way in which we achieved these results was now under the microscope. And one of the insistences by this boss was to clarify that the things that I said on stage were exaggerations, but they were not. And this led to a very tenuous relationship between my boss and I. And we had a falling out. I refused to go on this apology tour. And what I experienced in the aftermath was, I need to find a nice way to say this, but again, I've checked this recently with lawyers and to make sure that I can speak about this in a way that honors my experience without disparaging the people involved. But I would describe this as professional alienation. I would go as far as saying there were certain elements of it that I would describe as bullying. I was being deprived of opportunities, budget was being reduced, difficult situations were being perpetuated. I was experiencing ostracization from a sort of in group. The one on ones became infrequent, they became less personal. We eventually transitioned from a transactional to a purely transformational to a purely transactional relationship. And the final words uttered to me by my boss at the time were, "You are the most difficult employee I've ever worked with." And this broke my heart because if you ask anybody else I've worked with and continue to work with, The opposite couldn't be more true. I've been nothing but delightful. I strive with every fiber of my being to be of service, to practice, um, everything that I preached in that TEDx talk, Stop Managing, Start Leading. And this was such an aberration for my career path. It rocked my confidence. It made me feel less than in ways that I'm only recovering from now. Um, I stopped believing in the efficacy of the message, even though there was evidence that it was being so well received. I mean, it went viral for all intents and purposes, still till this day, being seen and being quoted by people around the world. I wish I could show you like my inbox, what it's like, just people telling me how galvanizing and uplifting and validating this message has been. I mean, the essence of it is in textbooks. It's used in curriculum around the world. I have built a thriving speaking, consulting, coaching career through this. But yet, in my soul, up until very recently, just before the pandemic, I thought, "Ah, man, I got something wrong here. Like, if I was able to cause this much disutility for an individual, an authority figure, someone who I perceive to be a leader, that I got it wrong." And just when I was about to, you know, blow out the last ember of this belief, I got a call from all people, a leadership professor in Australia. Shout out to James Hunt. And he said this to me. He said, "Hamza, this is the best TEDx talk I have ever seen in my life." And I was like, whoa. He's like, "I show this in my classes all the time. I would love it if you came to Australia to deliver a guest lecture in one of my classes for this." And we began a conversation. I tried to understand why he found this message so compelling. And he was telling me that he was deep into research about the dark triad of leadership, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the light triad of leadership, trying to bring it trying to bring an end to the management paradigm that was forged in the first and second industrial revolution, which is not serving the modern employee today. And he thought that my message captured the essence of that tension and needed to be explored some more. And so I went to Australia. I delivered a version of Stop Managing, Start Leading that incorporated all of my learnings from that time and all of my thinkings from that occurred in the time that elapsed. And Scott, it came back to me like the feeling, the energy, just knowing that we've struck a chord, we've said the quiet part out loud. This idea just flowed back into my veins in a very profound way. And then what happened immediately after that is the world shut down. The COVID-19 pandemic happened, and the fallout for me was a masterclass in all of the ideas that spawned from that. We got to see that management as a practice has reached the end of its life cycle, as evidenced by the many ways that leaders misstepped during the early days of the pandemic and are continuing to misstep as we emerge from the chaos. So that was a long way of saying, and I promise to keep my future answers more succinct, Scott. My thinking has changed on the topic in that I now believe in it more than I've ever believed in it before. The idea of Stop Managing, Start Leading, through my personal experiences, through my academic research, through my in the field research. This is an idea whose time has come. I believe this.
And to your point about the talk going viral, I just looked up the total amount of views. It's now at over 2.2 million views on YouTube. So it is definitely something that is still being listened to a lot, and really cool to think about how you've impacted like the millions of people who have watched this video. One thing you talked about in your answer was about the dark tribe and the, I think, light tribe of leadership. Yep. Can you define what those are?
Yeah. So the dark triad of leadership is a style of leadership that is practiced by people who exhibit what's known as the dark core of personality. So let me start with that. So the dark core of personality is this: it's the tendency to maximize individual utility while accepting, neglecting, or provoking disutility for others. So everybody has this. Everybody has the capacity to behave in a way that is antagonistic to others. They have the capacity to behave in a way that sees benefit for themselves immediately while accepting, neglecting, or provoking loss for other people. Like it's just a very zero-sum, selfish way of approaching life and, by extension, work. The dark triad of leadership are three subclinical traits namely narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, that are demonstrated by people who seek power. They're demonstrated, overrepresented in CEOs, overrepresented in leaders, and they tend to be developed over time. So the longer a leader is in a position of power, the more they typically demonstrate these traits, the dark triad of personality. What happens is leaders who demonstrate the dark triad of personality inadvertently create what's known as the toxic triangle of leadership. They, by virtue of the blind spots that they create and the way in which they disengage their employees, create an organization where they exist at the top. Just visualize a triangle, and then what they have on the other vertex of the triangle, one of them is conducive conducive followers, followers who are just disabled and unable to contribute meaningfully to the organization because they are, just existing to serve this despotic leader, if you will. And then on the other vertex of the triangle, you have a conducive environment. And this environment is perpetuated by a lack of governance, lack of ethics, and perceived threat. So it's just a nightmare. This type of organization becomes a burnout factory. It's just a type of organization in which people are disengaged all the time. And given a wide enough time scale, organizations like this always fail. And you can take your pick. You can pick new organizations like FTX. You can pick old organizations like BlackBerry. You can pick, ancient civilizations like the Roman Empire. You could even pick fictional empires like the Galactic Empire in Star Wars. They all demonstrate the same dynamic, which is you have a selfish leader who is high in dark triad traits, who eventually produces a toxic triangle. Now, the opposite, real quick, is the light triad of leadership. This is what employees have been demanding for a very long time. Not just employees, people. Everybody knows that they would rather be treated as ends unto themselves and not means. They would prefer that their dignity and worth is valued as individuals, and they would prefer that their leaders believe in the fundamental goodness of humans. So the three attributes of the light triad leadership are Kantianism, humanism, and faith in humanity, with those definitions that I just shared. That is where we need to go. And frankly, it's a much easier way to practice leadership of people.
Why do you think that power corrupts?
Well, you asked for a recommendation for a book, and I'm reading Corruptible right now. So good. In sum, why power corrupts is because the more power you have, and the longer for which and the length for which you possess the power, makes you aware of resources, makes you aware of what you have, and so we then naturally, as human beings, become defensive against actual and perceived loss. And this is best explained by the conservation of resources theory by Stephen A. Hopfall. Human beings experience psychological stress when there's a net loss of resources, when there's a perceived loss of, when there's a net loss of resources, there's a threat of a loss of resources, or there's a lack of reward following an investment of resources. So power, you're coming into contact with, let's just think about this in a very strictly organizational sense. You're coming into contact with greater responsibility, a bigger portfolio of work, arguably more money, probably a nicer office if that's your configuration of work style. And so naturally, once we have all of these things that make us more comfortable, that make our lives easier, we become more protective of them. And that's when that lizard brain, even though we're living in a modern era with godlike technology, we still are dealing with these primitive brains, these 10,000-year-old relics that are oriented towards preservation, self-preservation. And so we conflate the power that we have with the resources that need to be protected. But the opposite is true. We would actually gain more by giving away as much power as possible. It seems counterintuitive, but that's the idea at the heart of the light triad.
Fascinating. And one question that comes to mind is, how can leaders fight those impulses, that kind of lizard brain? If, let's say, someone's listening and they've been in a position of significant leadership or responsibility for like 30 years, or let's say they're planning to, right, or like they think that they might be in. How can they fight these impulses so that they don't succumb to a lot of these really deeply felt, deeply human desires?
Yeah, there's work that needs to be done structurally. We need to do a better job of creating better systems that weed out dark triad leaders or also prevent dark triad leaders from applying for these positions in the first place. But again, recognizing that we all possess this. I possess it, Scott. You possess it as well. But we work very hard to suppress these and override them, to train our brains, to train our being to be oriented towards serving others. So the idea here, first and foremost, is to do the seemingly counterintuitive thing in every leadership moment and make it about other people. We have to remember that the only assignment that we have as leaders is to make more leaders. As counterintuitive as that sounds, I think it was Gartner. Gartner does this survey every year where they survey approximately like 3,000 plus leaders, and they ask them what their top priorities are. And recently in 2023, top of the year, they asked this cadre of senior executives, including many CEOs, what your top priority is as a leader. And they selected things like, accelerating AI implementation, driving growth, increasing profitability, reducing costs, so on and so forth. And I was disappointed to see that focusing on employee engagement and well-being was like 6 out of 9 on this list. But here's the thing. I mean, all of the research, academic and practical, demonstrates that by focusing disproportionately on employee engagement, by ensuring that your employees are happy, that they're thriving, that then makes every other priority a natural byproduct. The best advice that I ever got was from a boss that I had very early in my leadership career. Actually, I think this was my very first leadership job. In my very first one-on-one with my very first boss, his name was Alan. He said, your job, Hamza, is to make yourself obsolete. And I was like, what? Like, can you say that again? What do you mean make myself obsolete? I literally just started. And he said, well, if you do this correctly, you will follow the same dynamics and the same steps necessary to level up in your career. You'll document processes, you'll hire correctly, you'll create succession plans, you'll train effectively, and the natural byproduct of this is that you will become hands off. And then I replied to that, but then what am I going to do when I become hands off? And he said, that's easy. You'll build more systems and create more leaders. You'll just repeat the same process over and over again. You'll build systems and create more leaders. And, I got to be honest with you, I didn't understand fully what he meant 15 years ago when he said that. But I followed his advice, and my life, my career has been a wild ride since then. Uh, Deeply rewarding. I've only experienced ascension as a leader, as an entrepreneur, as a business person, through the work that I do, the awards that have been earned, the accolades, the clients that I've been able to work with. I mean, it's very true that when you focus on giving power away, when you focus on making more leaders, your job becomes easier, but you strengthen the organization. And it seems counterintuitive in the moment to give that away, but that's ultimately what needs to be done.
When a listener is thinking about these two extremes of leaders, let's say one would be the dark triad, really authoritarian kind of leader, and then on the flip side, the very human centric, very supportive of a devolution of power and authority kind of leader. Who are like celebrity leaders that you think kind of typify these different extremes?
I'm glad you asked this question. And I just want to clarify one point. So if you're listening to this podcast right now, you can be rest assured that you are not a dark triad leader. Dark triad leaders very rarely make it to the upper echelons of organizations, and they're not the ones who are seeking out information like the ones that we're discussing today. You might score relatively low on a dark triad scale. I score on a dark triad scale. I think the last check that I did, high in narcissism, and I think that comes with building a personal brand, being a marketer, being a communicator, being a thought leader. I think about myself, even though I don't want to think about myself. I'm very introverted, shy, socially awkward, but I have to conjure up sort of like this character, HK, Hamza Khan, that is there. And so I score high on narcissism, but low on Machiavellianism and low on psychopathy. But it's there. Like it's again, it's subclinical. You can still be effective. A famous dark triad leader, believe it or not, Barack Obama. Barack Obama scores on the dark triad scale, but he was still effective, right? He was able to control that. But thinking about some celebrity examples that are relevant in the world of business. Okay, how about this? I wrote about them actually in Leadership Reinvented. So some dark triad leaders are Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, um, Adam Newman of WeWork, Travis Kalanick of Uber, These are all leaders who were consumed by their dark triad traits, who ultimately just fumbled their organizations by disengaging their employees and eventually creating these dark, toxic triangle structures. And then they were summarily either found guilty of crimes in the case of Elizabeth Holmes, or removed by their board in the case of Travis Kalanick, or just nearly ran their company into the ground like Adam Newman of WeWork. On the flip side, though, some of the light triad leaders that come to mind, Eric Yuan of Zoom is a good example. I think the gold standard would be Satya Nadella of Microsoft. Very interesting example. And recently, and this is a complicated one because she left her post. So Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, I remember there was an article a couple of months ago, actually years ago, maybe a year, maybe 2 years ago, where she left her position because she was experiencing burnout. And I thought to myself, my goodness, like what's going on over here? Like this leader who is as human centric as they get decided to leave their post, like decided to abandon the prime minister post. And I thought, wow, that is actually the most human centric decision you could do when you become self aware that you are no longer serving in the way that is expected of you, when you can no longer add value in the way that you know you can add value. The most human centric thing you can do is step back and empower somebody else to step in. And I thought that was really powerful, but it took me a while to just really adjust my mental model. I'm currently thinking about like, there's a lot of there's a lot of value to be gained from emulating people who are doing this well, and also seeing people who are not doing it well as cautionary tales. But I caution people against this approach. It's good to extract these values and to study them from a distance, but we have to be careful with idol worship. And I was saying this as somebody who wrote a very prosaic chapter about Bob Iger in my book. I talked about Bob Iger as being a very innovative, human-centric leader, but this was in 2021. In 2023, my thinking about this has changed. In fact, I'm probably going to update the book in future versions to talk about how Bob Iger is now losing his way and actually behaving in a way that I would not describe as human-centric, especially when we're looking at the current SAG and WGA negotiations and his approach to that. I could go on, Scott. I'm just rambling at this point, but those are like maybe 7 examples of dark triad leaders and light triad leaders.
One thing to double click on is, why do you think that President Obama is a dark triad leader?
This is a good question. And again, this is not not a conclusion that I arrived at naturally, but it is discussed quite extensively in leadership literature that Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, some of these more, how do I say this? Celebrity politicians, the types who are, usually on talk shows, who sort of like venture outside of the Oval Office and engage in more. I don't know how to say this. I'm losing my words over here, but let me come back to that. Scott. There's a very specific study that was done on this that looked at all of the US presidents and how they might score on a dark triad scale. And I remember being surprised by seeing Barack Obama as high on that list. But and here's the thing, the important thing though, is that just because he scores high on the dark triad list doesn't actually mean he's an ineffective leader. In fact, in some industries, having dark triad traits can actually work in your favor. And I think that the highest office of government is one of those, where narcissism, this belief in yourself, self-aggrandizing behavior can actually work in your favor by galvanizing people around you, by creating a cult of personality. And so it actually worked in Barack Obama's favor in the same way that I would, imagine it's working in Justin Trudeau. Oh, I mean, maybe that's a bad example. Maybe it's working against Justin Trudeau these days, but it certainly worked during the Trump campaign and so on and so forth. But these traits do eventually reach their breaking point. They eventually get to a point where they're no longer productive. I would even say that they're counterproductive, and it's imperative that leaders recognize that well in advance and then make necessary adjustments.
And I can think even of like the lessons from like Shakespeare's Macbeth, right? And a lot of these Shakespearean tragedies of how power can become this like all-consuming thing that can almost result in like mental illness at a certain point, where it so distorts somebody's view of like what is like reality. Like it can be very challenging. And it's also interesting. A second thing that I reflect on is this idea that came up in a book I recently read, which there's some proposals for, imagine if you didn't have like elected officials, let's say in a
Okay.
Senate. So the parliament would be all elected by, or the House of Representatives, by people, by the people. But then you would
Sure.
have a Senate, and the Senate would be appointed by, would be full of random people. So
Interesting.
literally, it would just be a lottery, and you would just pick like literally 100 random people from like the phone book,
Yeah.
and then they would become the members of the Senate, and then they would serve a certain period of term, and then once that term is over, it's up. And this model has existed in different places. They're called like citizens' assemblies. So I
Love it.
believe it was in Switzerland they've had the model. But the reason why it's an interesting model, I think, is that often if someone is attracted to run for public office, they have these dark triad impulses,
Yes.
like you said. And if you had a upper body of parliament that was literally just composed of random people, they're much likely less likely to have these dark triad impulses, and it would potentially yield a better form of government. Just to footnote where this idea
Sure.
comes from is Martin Wolf's The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism, which is really interesting read, where he also has a lot of solutions. But yeah, this is a somewhat off topic, but what are your thoughts on like these kinds of citizens assemblies, like building democratic institutions where you just pick random people?
Huge. Oh my goodness. I love that we're really getting deep into this. And again, this is a testament to the community that you've created. I felt so empowered when I delivered the keynote last year, or was it earlier this year? I don't even remember. What is time anymore? I think it was earlier this year, right? No?
Yeah, it was earlier this year. It was in
April.
April.
It was April. Wow. Oh my goodness. It feels like it was yesterday, but it also feels like it was like 5 years ago. Uh, when I delivered that talk, I remember either in the Q&A or in the presentation itself speaking about this idea of a grandmother council. I think it was after, and I said that there are some tribes, some indigenous tribes in which above the chief, above the primary ruler, there exists a council of grandmothers who are entrusted with the responsibility of asking the question of how does this decision support life? Anytime a decision is made about the tribe, for the tribe, it has to be run by this council of grandmothers, people who understand, in their core, what it's like to create life across multiple generations and support life across multiple generations, how a decision supports life. And I thought that was brilliant. In fact, I'm experimenting with the idea that in this new company that I'm building, what would it look like if we created a layer above the board of governors, above the board of advisors, just essentially replicate the grandmother council idea? What kind of decisions would a business make if we had that kind of wisdom, elder wisdom, hard coded in the DNA of the organization? I like the idea. I like the idea of regulating power that pools in the form of one person. I like the idea of a citizen council, of a grandmother council. I like the idea of fixed terms, of there being appropriate checks and balances and psychological safety within an organization to inform a leader that they are no longer adding value, that they might even be hurting the organization. And it's interesting. I stumbled on my answer with Barack Obama because my mind was going in like 10 different directions, trying to pick up on the specific book, the specific paper in which I came across this conclusion about him. But I think what might be even more useful to this conversation, but especially to the listeners, is that I can speak to my own examples, my own experiences of succumbing to the dark triad. What's that saying? Sometimes research is really me search. And so my obsession with these models is really an attempt to understand how I have behaved in the past. A couple of companies ago, I was running a boutique marketing agency called Splash Effect. And in the early days of Splash Effect, we made quite the splash as one of the few agencies in Toronto, in Canada, and I would even argue in the world, that was owned and operated by a mostly BIPOC team. And so naturally, we were getting a lot of attention. It's like, what is this upstart organization that is focused on doing good in the education, government, and healthcare sectors, run by these two, South Asian individuals? And man, it was fun because I got to hit the speaking circuit quite a bit. I was on panels, doing workshops, keynotes, winning all kinds of awards, doing interviews, radio, television, um, and I really got caught up in in the feelings that came with being the shiny object. And I think certainly my narcissism was being fueled, and it was working because I thought that I was actually doing something valuable for the organization by drumming up all this attention, by being the influencer to my organization. And then one day, my co-founder messages me and says, "Hey, man, like got bad news." And this hit me like a ton of bricks out of the blue. He said, "Bad news. We're going to miss payroll this quarter." I was like, "What? Say that again? Like, not even this cycle, this quarter?" He's like, "Yeah, we dropped the ball." Like, um, and I said, "How did this happen? Like, how didn't we see this coming?" And he said to me, "He's like, I've been trying to get a hold of you. I've been trying to tell you this for a long time. I've been asking you to come into the office to like take your foot off the gas for this publicity run you've been on and actually focus on the business and like help me solve some problems here. Like there's some cash flow challenges we're running into. Some clients are their payment cycles, they're delinquent on their payment cycles. We've onboarded a bunch of staff as per your recommendation. We've just found ourselves in a unique position in which the money going out is not being offset by the money coming in." And man, I was devastated. I remember I cried myself to sleep like for several days, thinking like I had completely failed as a leader. I had developed such a blind spot by making this about myself, by making my position, making my leadership about serving me at that point. And man, it was tough because I had to explain that week in a team meeting to the team that they weren't going to be able to pay their bills. They weren't going to be able to take care of their dependents. They weren't going to be able to put food on the table. They weren't going to be able to pay off their student loans because I had failed them as a leader. I had failed them as a leader by succumbing to the dark triad of leadership in the most innocuous of ways. I thought that I was doing something right. And so the dark triad doesn't necessarily mean you're evil. It doesn't necessarily mean you're malicious. It could just be that in this case and in most cases, you are misguided. And that's what happened to me.
And to your point, I think we all have various tendencies to get pulled into that dark triad. Like it's a spectrum. I think that there's some people who are more have a greater tendency than others, but there's definitely there's times in my life where I have been pulled into the dark triad, and I think that
Sure.
one of the things that is important, I think, for all leaders is to understand the dark triad exists and to have that a sense of like awareness. Because, and even if let's say you're listening and maybe you are like a really intense dark triad leader, like in the sense that you have those impulses, one of the main things I think that you can do is just being aware of it. And then through that awareness, you can manage it. You can maybe try to control it in different kinds of ways. And that's why I think a book I would really recommend folks read is Awareness by Anthony DeMello. I think kind of on this topic. Have you read Awareness out of interest, Hamza?
No, I'm writing this down. I'm going to jump on this book right after we're done here.
It's a great read, really interesting philosophy, and just talking about how we all have different sort of self-destructive tendencies, but when we have awareness of those, it can change our relationship. But it goes into a lot more detail. One thing I would love to explore a little bit more, Hamza, is just thinking around some tips for managers, for leaders on how they can foster this more prestige style of leadership, this more kind of coaching style of leadership. So let's say someone's a manager and they're thinking about how they run or how they facilitate like one-on or set up one-on-ones with their direct reports. How does a prestige leader facilitate a one-on-one meeting in a way that promotes that sense of autonomy of agency with their colleague who does report into them?
Yeah, excellent question. I think one-on-ones are the closest thing that we have to a magical cure when it comes to employee engagement and employee thriving. I think I not even think I know it at this point that a leader's effectiveness can be predicted by the total amount the frequency of one-on-ones with their subordinates. I can look at a leader's calendar and I could make a pretty good guess about what kind of leader they are based on how often they meet with their teams, their colleagues in a structured way. So before I answer that question, I just want to like hedge this by saying my blanket answer for like anyone listening to this right now that is looking to make that transition from management to leadership is to just do it, to stop managing and start leading. Stop managing altogether, even if the word manage is in your job title or job description, whether you are a manager, whether you are a managing director, whether you're a coordinator that has the word manage appear multiple times in their job description, that's fine. Because like I said, you can manage things like tasks, events, processes, budgets, events, but people are meant to be led. And so the approach that you should take, Scott, and I'm glad you asked this question, in a one-on-one, is to think of them as checkups, like going to a doctor. Have them as often as possible. My recommendation would be weekly. If you can't do weekly, bi-weekly. If you can't do bi-weekly, the lowest frequency you should have is monthly. Anything longer than that, you're risking the feedback loop becoming too lengthy and the development of blind spots to become more likely. Keep them private because they are, of course, one-on-ones. You want to guarantee psychological safety for the person that you're speaking with. Have them pre-scheduled. Just make them recurring events. Don't move them unless it's an emergency, and keep them structured. For the first 10 minutes, make it about, assuming they're 30 minutes each, make the first 10 minutes about your employee's agenda, whatever they want to speak about, whatever's top of mind for them. And you can even ask that question in a very coaching way. You can say, what's coming, like, what's top of mind for you? What's on your mind that is in your way from you? What is getting in the way of you doing your best work? And again, empower them to be able to give you pointed feedback if you are the person getting in the way as a leader of them doing their best work. The middle 10 should be about your agenda. Try to keep it focused on the problems. I like to say go hard on the problems, but soft on the people. Focus on the actual problem versus directing your criticism to the person necessarily. And then the last 10 is where the magic happens. This should be about the future. This should be about what it would take for the employee to remain happy in the organization and to move from survival to thriving. So in this way, done correctly, a one-on-one becomes an opportunity to not only diagnose problems, but to generate solutions, to remove obstacles, to celebrate victory, and to plan ahead. That's how a one-on-one should be done. And a great tool I'd recommend, a free tool to everybody, is Manager Tools. Type in manager-tools.com. They have such great resources, one-on-one templates, templates that scale according to the style of one-on-ones you have, industry, so on and so forth. Just a great resource that has been instrumental in my career and continues to be informative and helpful.
Those are great tips. And another area that I would love to explore a little bit more about, which you talked about in your keynote remarks at the Venture for Canada All Things People conference, is our town halls. So, Hamza, how can a town hall be used within a company or corporate setting to facilitate and increase employee engagement?
Scott, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad you were into that. That seems to be an idea that really resonated with people. I still get messages about it today from attendees as well, but like what this would look like. So think of town halls as like a one-on-one at scale with everyone in the organization. Treat them almost like milestones in a larger listening tour. I am very lucky that I get to go on these speaking tours where I'm on stage for 45 minutes to 60 minutes at a time and I get to speak to an audience. But the way I operate with my own company is I invert that. I try to remain as silent as possible. I ask questions. And what this does is it, first of all, normalizes private experiences. So the discussions that you're having in these one-on-ones that we discussed in the earlier question, people might feel like they're alone in their experiences. But when you talk about them in a public forum, when you invite people to give you feedback about what's working, what's not working, what could be done differently, how you're doing as a leader, if people still trust you, if they trust in your judgment about the future, so on and so forth, ask difficult questions. It normalizes experiences so people don't feel like they're alone. But then also for us as leaders and for the listeners who identify as leaders, hopefully everybody, you get scary feedback. And scary feedback is so important because that which we most need to find is often where we're least willing to look. And so that feedback illuminates blind spots. It creates awareness. Thinking back to the book recommendation you gave, it creates awareness that illuminates blind spots and ensures better focus on engagement. Because when you're able to see that you are developing dark triad traits or the organization is starting to resemble a toxic triangle, if people are empowered and psychologically safe to create awareness for you as a leader, you're able to diagnose that and address it swiftly. So yeah, town halls and one-on-one should be used in tandem in this way.
One challenge that I've sometimes seen with town halls, and I can think in particular at my time working at Goldman Sachs, actually before I worked full time and when I interned, I remember we would do these town halls, and there was one person from my team. She was, and there were hundreds of people who were down these town halls. She was always one of like the two or three people who would ask a question. And often I found too is that the kind of questions that are often asked in public settings, sometimes they can be tough depending on the
Yeah.
organizational culture, but often they can be very sycophantic. They're very
Yes.
like, oh, how amazing are you? Or they're not really going to substantive issues. How can someone set up a town hall so that you're getting that authentic feedback and it's not just massaging of a leader's ego?
Yeah, excellent. And I think you have demonstrated that quite well. So we had a pre-call, right? We had a pre-call a couple of months ago for this podcast recording. And during that time, we said we're candid. Let's ask each other any questions. Nothing is off limits over here. You created a psychologically safe space for me to ask you questions, and I do have some questions for you as well, Scott. But I said the same thing to you as well. I said, ask me difficult questions. And some questions were given to me in advance, and we've stayed on script for the most part. But I love that you've been actually probing me and pushing me and asking me questions that are actually making me uncomfortable in the best way possible, because this is then allowing me to really just dive deep and excavate my own experiences and synthesize learnings that are not canned and planned. And I love that. So the one thing that you could do, and I do this for all of my keynotes now, at the outset, I say, please ask me a question that you don't think that you think is inappropriate to ask. Like, ask me the difficult question, challenge something I've said. If something is bothering you, acknowledge that, because chances are, if you're thinking about them, somebody else is thinking about them. Coming back to my point about normalizing experiences, we're actually doing ourselves and doing our organization a disservice by keeping those questions in. And so I would love it if leaders could say at the beginning of the town hall, like, ask the difficult questions, ask me the thing that you are hesitating to ask. That's how we do it. Give permission to ask the thing that you don't want to be asked.
Give permission and create that overall culture, the overall norms where it's like accepted, it's encouraged for folks to give that kind of transparent feedback as well as ask those tough questions. One thing I'd
Scott,
love,
sorry, can I add one
yeah,
thing real quick? This, you just inspired an idea, and I think this is like keynote worthy over here. And I hope that it's something that you and I do for our respective organizations. I'm working with a professional coach. I have been throughout my career, but this new one is really pushing me. And every week she sends me a form in advance of our session. And one of the questions that I hate answering is this one. She asks, what is one question that you hope I won't ask you in our coaching session? And I have to answer it honestly. And it's usually the question that she opens the coaching session with. So here's a cool idea. We as leaders, if we're dealing with a team that is not used to being as free as we want them to be, if they don't feel psychologically safe, if they are hesitant to speak up, what we could do is preempt some of those questions, and as leaders say, these are the questions that I hope you won't ask me, and put them up on a screen, and then let it sit there and then see what happens. I think I'm
I,
actually going to start doing this with my team. These are the questions I hope you won't ask me, and then maybe somebody will ask you that question given enough of a groundswell.
I love that. Out of interest, what are some of the questions that you put into that form, the questions that you don't want your coach to ask you?
Okay, wow, I'm going to be honest. I was putting me on the spot here, man. I said, don't ask me why I feel nervous about this upcoming podcast opportunity I have. And she asked me that question. I had to unpack with my coach why I was feeling nervous about this. And I think I briefly alluded to it when I was talking with yourself and Latifa just before we hit record. It's like, I'm aware that, I occupy a role in the world where I try to be of service and share these ideas on the dichotomy of management versus leadership, transcending leadership, building more human centric organizations. But man, deep down, I'm like a 14-year-old nerd that's just in awe that this is happening. I'm just like, whoa, I cannot believe that I get a chance to sit down with Scott from Venture for Canada and this incredible team that's doing amazing work across the country and around the world. Work with, consummate professionals like Latifa, and like, what could I possibly add of value to this? And then I just had to sit back, unpack that, be with those emotions and be like, trust the process, man. Like, this is bigger than me. I have to trust that Scott and Latifa are gonna hold me and guide me through this process, and that's how I feel. Hopefully, this has been valuable uh, to all of us over here. It's certainly been valuable to me, and I hope that it's also valuable to the listeners. And I trust that it is. It's not my job to critique if this is good or not. I just have to keep that channel open. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to do this.
It's been super valuable. And, I think that imposter syndrome, which is in essence what you described, is something that a lot of leaders deal with, including at every, I think, kind of level. One thing that I would love to double click on is the role of coaches. And you talked a little bit about how it sounds like you work weekly with a coach. How
Mhm.
can a coach help a manager to, or a leader to stop managing and start leading?
That's a great question. I can say this now as a recently certified executive coach with the ICF, International Coaching Federation and Association for Coaching. I didn't believe in the power at first. I've had life coaches, I've had career coaches, but this new coach that I'm working with describes themselves, and I describe the coaching practice as some combination of like a sparring partner that helps you become a better boxer, better fighter. But even if you remove sort of the unnecessarily violent context from this, like a dancing partner, somebody that helps you to become better in your craft. And so, for me, coaching is a generative process in which I'm able to bring a problem that I have been unable to solve on my own, or I'm having difficulty solving on my own, something that needs to be untangled, something that I need to be pushed on. And so, what I trust these coaches with is to unpack my thinking about a process, about a problem, and then design a solution, generate a solution. And so, we're doing this right now through this new company that I'm building right now. The first service that this new company offers is executive coaching. Our two clients have come to us with a desire to make the learning stick from a larger leadership development program where they're going to learn all sorts of skills like, communication, feedback, intergenerational understanding, resilience, productivity, and they want to increase their leaders' capacity to lead the organization. But what we do then as a executive coaching attache to this larger program is we put the responsibility, we put the onus in the coachee's realm, and they come to us with a specific problem that they have. They might come to us and say, you know, uh, I'm stuck on this, or, I don't believe in this, or I want to do X, but this is getting in the way. And then what we do as coaches, as executive coaches, is we say, okay, but, why is this important to you? Why are you stuck on this? What would need to be true for you to be not stuck on this? And if we find them getting into ruts in their thinking, we ask why. And then we probe deeper, but why? But why? And usually go like 5 levels deep. And the real magic happens is when the coachee arrives at the conclusion themselves. That's what we ultimately want as coaches, is to just remove the cobwebs to help them untangle their problems. And that transition from manager to leader is such a huge shift, and people are going to get stuck. I get stuck on it every single day. It's hard sometimes to make a decision that seems counterintuitive to make leadership about other people. There's some days where I'm just like, oh man, I really just want to be a manager right now. But it's my therapist and coach's voices, my mentor's voices, and my own voice now that I'm really bringing in, which asks, you know, what is the right thing to do here? What is the responsible thing to do here? What is the job of a leader? And the job of a leader is ultimately to make more leaders. But that clarity of thought has only come through a long process of working with these dance and sparring partners.
And a great coach can be a game changer. And shout out to Alicia, my current coach, who's been awesome. And there's definitely a correlation between, I think, the effectiveness of a coach and their willingness to push back and to ask
Amen.
really tough questions. One thing you've talked about in other settings, including at the Venture for Canada conference, is the role of managers in the future. Um, Hamza, 20 years from now, what do you think will be the role of managers, and how does that compare and contrast to today?
20 years from now, the role of managers will be nothing, non existent. Management has reached its logical conclusion. And I believe the logical conclusion has been a collective awareness of its inefficacy for this iteration of the human civilization. It served us, arguably, during the turn of the century when we had to just rapidly industrialize. Even then, I would argue that it mostly served a small group of people relative to the general population. But we're here. We can't go back and fix the past. Moving forward, we all know in our hearts that we don't want to be managed, and we're not willing to put up with the structures of management. And I would dare say, even oppression as a form of ultimate management. We don't want this. We have not wanted this. And now that we're able to articulate it and speak about it so candidly in a forum like the one that you've created over here, it fills me with optimism. I think managers need to realize that regardless of their job title, regardless of their job description, that their job is to lead. And as we open this podcast with, successful leadership is prestige leadership. It results in the replication of that leadership. But a leader's job is ultimately to make more leaders.
I love that. And it relates actually a lot to my personal mission statement, which is to support others to achieve their full potential. And that's a lot of reason why I created Venture for Canada. But I went through this exercise a couple of years ago around like, what is my personal mission statement? And it's different. Venture for Canada's is more specific. It's to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindset of young Canadians. And I think if I just copied Venture for Canada's mission statement to myself, it wouldn't be healthy. And then I thought to myself, like, what is my own personal mission statement in life? The one I just read is the one that comes to mind. So a question I have for you, Hamza, is what is
Sure.
your personal life mission statement?
It changes all the time, but it's centered around the idea of co-creating the future. It has to be done together. It can't be designed by one person in a vacuum. It has to be a truly collaborative experience, and it has to be positive sum. It has to be in support of life itself. Our work needs to be oriented towards creating positive sum value generations into the future. I love the indigenous wisdom around this idea that our descendants don't inherit the world from us; we borrow it from them. So we have a responsibility in the present moment to think about them. And oh, a fantastic book. I cannot recommend this enough. Ministry for the Future. Have you read this one? Oh,
Yeah, I love that book. One of my favorites
so
from,
good, right?
yeah, really, really good.
Incredible. And bringing it back, to Barack Obama, one of his favorite books as well. And he actually said something in an interview. I think it was for Vice many years ago. He said it was the hardest thing to do as a leader is to convince this generation of colleagues to make. And he was talking about citizens, but thinking about this as leaders of our respective companies. The hardest thing for us to do as a leader is to convince the people that we're with right now to make a decision that serves people that are not in the room, people who are going to be there in the future, people who are non-existent, children who haven't been born yet. So that is my North Star. It's orienting, spiritually orienting and harmonizing the world's leaders, and by extension, organizations, to work in concert towards serving each other. And that seems utopian, but man, if we really want to get there, in 5 billion years, one of three things is going to happen. Like there's going to be a heat death in the universe, there's going to be a freeze death, or there's going to be something else. In all three of those scenarios, Earth ends. Not to end this podcast in a very bleak note, but the truth is, like 5 billion years from now, uh, Earth's not going to 5 million or 5 billion, one of the two. We're not going to be here. Earth's not going to be here. So we actually have a civilizational imperative to get off the planet. And I would love it if we just aligned everybody's efforts towards unlocking the best in each other, helping everybody become leaders, helping everybody ascend up Maslow's hierarchy of needs towards self actualization and transcendence, so that we can collectively design a solution that will ensure that our greatest descendants, our greatest grandchildren can thrive and won't suffer one of these three apocalypse scenarios. I don't know why I'm laughing. I felt empowered, psychologically safe to just say the thing that has been in my soul for a very long time.
I love that, Hamza. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. You're a very unique thinker who does a great job crossing boundaries from like psychology, or kind of crossing disciplines from like psychology to management theory to literature to philosophy. I really like how you mix a lot of different ideas together that a lot of times people often treat as separate. And really appreciate you coming on the podcast. This has been a really
Ah,
thought
thank you,
provoking
sir.
convo.
Thank you, sir. And if I may quickly just pay you a compliment as well here. I think I've said this to you before, but I'll say it again. It became very clear to me at the Venture for Canada event that you are a servant leader, that you are a manifestation of all of the ideas that you and I have shared today. And of course, as leaders, we stumble, we fall, we make mistakes, and you're very humble and you admit that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But man, given a wide enough time scale, the work that you're doing here with Venture for Canada is phenomenal. The best evidence for me is that every single one of the teammates that you have as part of V4C, independent of our conversation, even before knowing you, um, very positive, bought into the mission, happy, thriving, excited, very supportive. The way that they treated me throughout the entire onboarding process, from becoming a prospective speaker to becoming the speaker to then now this relationship that we have after the fact, is a reflection of what I believe is the level of care that you demonstrate to them. How you treat your team is how they've treated me. And my experiences with you have been very consistent with that. They've been very validating. And you're, sir, you inspire me. You are a gold standard for me, for a human-centric leader, a leader who's building a truly human-centric organization. And I celebrate you, and I'm just so grateful to be in your presence, to have this opportunity to talk shop with you and beyond.
Well, you inspired me as well, and a lot of actionable learnings from this conversation, Hamza. And I definitely have things I need to work on as well. But I appreciate the kind words. And leadership is definitely a ongoing journey for everybody. As an ancient rabbi once said, the most important work is the work that has no end. So thank you so much, Hamza, and
Great. That's a good one.
looking forward to our future conversations.
Thank you, sir. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.